Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. This video is the first video in a two-part series where we're going to build some terrain to help celebrate the launch of the new Flames of War release, Battle of the Bulge Americans. The new Battle of the Bulge Americans book is almost here, and I'm pretty excited. This supplement is going to introduce some really cool new tanks of Flames of War, and as a player that sometimes likes to play American forces, I'm really eager to get some new options on the table. To get ready for this, I've got some new terrain. I've got the ruined building set, the Dusseldorf house, and the city square sets, all from Battlefield in a Box. These awesome pieces of terrain are compatible with Flames of War and really any other 15mm system, and will make a good foundation to build some interesting pieces for my new Battle of the Bulge Americans to fight over. The Battle of the Bulge is known for winter fighting, and winter terrain pieces just aren't something I really regularly make, and they wouldn't match my current battlefield. So I was a little at a loss. But then I realized by looking through the book that the Battle of the Bulge Americans actually covers a very wide range of time frames within World War II, including other seasons, specifically those that don't have snow on the ground. So now I'm going to go ahead and prepare these buildings to make them as visually interesting as possible. In the next video in the series, we're going to move ahead and finish the bases and do the landscaping. As always, I started by coming up with a general plan. I laid out the parts I had for the production, in this case the buildings, and some other pieces I wanted to include. I had some 3D printed brick walls and some trees left over from a previous layout I was working on, and I thought this might be a good spot to use them. Once I had decided on what to include, I took the parts, went outside, and spray painted them matte black. Now in this video, I want to handle primarily the painting of the buildings themselves, but I needed to know first how the bases were going to be laid out. I put down the town square in the middle of my table, measured around it, and came up with a rough idea of what the bases were going to be sized as. All of the bases were going to be about 5 centimeters wide, while the larger buildings were going to be on bases about 30 centimeters long, and the shorter ones were going to be on bases about 11 centimeters long. With this planned out, I traced it out on some black foam core, got out a foam core cutting knife, and cut the bases out. Now I could lay the parts out on the bases and see exactly how everything would be laid out. With this in mind, I now could begin work on painting the buildings themselves. 3 of the buildings had a similar exterior that was sort of like a plaster or a stucco over brick or some sort of stone. I decided I was going to do those all in a very similar way. The 4th building was a little different. It had a stone exterior, and I would need to use a different technique on it. Going to the stucco buildings, I decided to start with a darker color, in this case camouflage medium brown, and sprayed it over the whole exterior. Then I went to a mid-tone by mixing camouflage medium brown 50-50 with port stone. I sprayed that on the model as well, focusing on the areas towards the outside or anywhere where the light would hit the building directly. When this had dried, I then went to pure port stone and did the same thing again, but concentrated more towards the extreme edges of the building, and then I let this all dry. With this complete, I got out Vallejo Off-White and applied it with a dry brush over the whole model. This brought out the texture and increased the contrast with the highlights on the edges of the model. With the other stucco buildings, I followed the same pattern, starting with an airbrush coat of a dark color, moving to a mid-tone, then a highlight, and then finally a dry brush. I altered the colors slightly, adding some gray here or there, or some warmer off-white colors. This kept the buildings looking similar, but all distinctly different. The stone building had a lot of excellent texture on the exterior, so I thought I could do the whole model with a dry brush. I started with saddle brown, then added a little light gray to the saddle brown mix, and went back over it. Finally, I went with pure light gray, and then gave the whole model an off-white dry brush. I thought this gave it a suitably stony look, and altered the colors, making it distinct from the stucco buildings. Now I went on to the smaller building details. Each building had some trim and some shutters on it, so I thought I would vary these up by painting them different colors. Generally, though, I followed the same pattern. I started with a dark base color, added a little white to it to make it slightly brighter, and then finished off with a quick dry brush of white. When this was done, the contrast was pretty sharp, and admittedly they were looking a little chalky. So I got out some Army Painter Quick Shader Soft Tone and went over top of each of the accent colors. When this had dried, it had toned down the contrast, and I thought it looked pretty good. Next, I needed to move on to the roof. I finished each of the roofs very similarly. I started with a deck tan dry brush, and then went over top of everything with an off-white dry brush. Because I had been relying so heavily on dry brushing so far, I had lost some contrast here and there. So I went in, got out some black ink, and went back over all the cracks, deep places, and any crevices on the models. This built up some dark shadows and made some of the smaller details stand out. Also at this time, I poured out a little more black paint and went back and painted in the window frames. By now I thought the houses were looking pretty good, but they were looking a little pristine for being in a war zone, so I thought I should give them some wear and tear. I got out my weathering pencils, moistened the tips, and then went back and drew some shadows and some streaks onto the buildings. When these had partially dried, I got out a moist paintbrush and blended these into the surface of each building. Here and there, I thought it would add some character to put some scorch marks and areas where the buildings may have burnt on the exterior, so I got out some dry pigments in burnt umber and black, and just went ahead and dusted those onto the outside. I worked them into the exterior using a stiff bristle brush. When this was done, and I thought it looked suitably like burn marks, I then took out my airbrush and loaded it with some matte varnish. I then went over all of the buildings with a couple thin coats to seal in and protect my work that I had done so far. So that pretty much finished up the buildings themselves, and now it's time to move on to the bases. We're going to cover this in my next video. Keep an eye out, it'll be out shortly, and we're going to continue to celebrate the release of Battle of the Bulge American for Flames of War. Thanks for watching. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't done so already. And as always, remember to keep building life in miniature.